there seems to be a lot of demand for Apple's iPhone X. But meeting this huge demand with supply is perhaps Apple's biggest challenge of all time. Numerous reports from Bloomberg suggest that Apple is facing a series of supply-side issues, which could ultimately be a dampener for the tech major's sales. Just how grave are these issues, and will this hurt consumer sentiment? To discuss this, I'm joined by Corey Johnson of Bloomberg News and Tarun Pathak, Associate Director at Counterpoint Research. Guys, thanks so much for joining us on Bloomberg Quinn. Corey, I want to start by asking you, what has really led to this supply problem at Apple with the iPhone X?
Well, some could call it a demand success rather than a supply problem, right? They've got a lot of demand for this phone globally. They've certainly added a lot of new features to this phone. And so there's some degree of where they really have to go back and start everything over again, that the architecture of this phone is so very different than anything they have made or anyone has made before, the facial recognition, the size of the phone, and so on, that they really do have to start from scratch here. But there's also tremendous demand for the phone. There are no supply problems on popular products. It's a very popular product, and the global demand for it, as witnessed by the early orders taken last night, is evidence of that.
You know, Corey, even back here in India, it seems to be sold out on Amazon and on a local e-commerce player, Flipkart. But I'm also saying this because, the pieces that we've read on Bloomberg as well, saying the biggest problem, and I quote this piece, the dot projector is at the heart of Apple's production problems. And it seems that they've had issues with suppliers and vendors. And although, when it comes to facial ID, there was also talk that perhaps it won't be the same facial ID that was advertised in the big launch event.
Yeah, we'll see the quality of that, and I think that that's a big bogey in terms of what could happen with the sales of this phone, how successful facial ID is, and how much consumers really like it. Because early complaints about that would be a problem for Apple. But because the product's not in the marketplace, I think we're going to have to categorize a lot of these things as rumors and unknowns at this point. What is clear is that they were able to ship the iPhone 8 much earlier than they're able to ship this iPhone 10. And the technology in the iPhone 10 is the big difference there, right? So clearly the technology in this phone is one of the holdups. I think there's also something about Apple's secrecy sort of writ large at the company, where they keep everything they're working on so secret that the developments that they're working on, that their suppliers and other companies that they work with can't really get ahead of the game, because Apple's not going to tell them what they want to be in that phone. So really, it is from the announcement, from the get-go, that the real production efforts have to begin. It's not before that, and as a result, the announcement happens, and there's a lag before they can actually get the product together and together at scale.
All right, I'm going to get Tarun in on this chat as well. Tarun, thanks so much for joining us. I want to understand, with all your numbers that Neil and your team have actually been working on at Counterpoint Research, the iPhone 8 didn't seem to be a very successful proposition when it comes to Apple. iPhone 8 and 8 Plus, it seems like a lot of people were waiting for the iPhone 10, especially here in India. Do you think that this is something that's a concern, especially if there's a supply not matching, the demand?
Correct. First of all, thanks for having me here. So if you look at, you have rightly pointed out, looks like the demand for iPhone X has been massive. But if you look at demand for iPhone 8, the preliminary checks from Counterpoint Research suggest that the demand for iPhone 8 has been soft across different regions. And it's not an ideal situation for any company to have this demand versus supply mismatch, especially for a company like Apple, which has been traditionally known for its strong supply chain requirements. So what that essentially means is this will leave Apple to three different situations. Either this particular demand will shift to the upcoming quarters, Q1, Q2, or what will happen is part of this demand will shift towards iPhone 8, iPhone 8 series. Now, there is another alternative which can happen in Q4 is most of the users try to look for switching to Android or upgrading from Android to Android camp. So that has been critical for Apple, because if you look at iPhone X, that could have tempted a lot of users from the Android camp to join or enter the iOS ecosystem. Now, that's an opportunity lost for Apple if this demand versus supply gap exceeds. So I think the number 3, which I have pointed, is very critical for Apple going forward, because if users from Android camp upgrade within Android, so for example, if a potential user of, say, S7 is looking to upgrade to iPhone 10, he or she may not wait for a couple of quarters and ended up buying or upgrading to Android ecosystem within the holiday season. So that's going to be very critical for Apple.
Very interesting, Tarun. And taking that point, Corey, and that's something that, well, investors have been fretting over, especially if Apple can't match well that demand, or if there's issues, especially whether you'd have consumers or potential buyers, flocking over to maybe Samsung or OnePlus. Is that a concern?
Yeah. Well, I think that the way that Apple's changed a lot of their billing procedures, where they've got users pre-ordering the phone, paying on a monthly basis to get whatever the latest update is, kind of locks them into the iPhone system and keeps them from going into Android phones, whether it's Samsung or whatever. And furthermore, what we know from the studies that have looked at this is that the people who switch from the Android ecosystem to the Apple ecosystem stay. It is a very sticky ecosystem, and the user experience is such that the users just tend to stay with that system, and once they've gone to an iPhone, they tend to replace it with another iPhone, not going back to Samsung. Certainly there are exceptions, but globally what we've seen is that people who go to the iPhone platform stay there. And so Apple has changed their billing procedures also, so a lot of users subscribe to the phone, pay on a monthly basis, and get whatever the new phone is. As a result, they've been paying for this upgrade. They're going to get it when the phone's out and when the phone's ready to ship. It also, therefore, provides a bumper, if you will, for Apple to have when they have production problems. It doesn't matter because the sale's baked in, and a consumer that's getting the phone 3 weeks later than they want it is going to get it anyway.
But Corey, this isn't characteristically Apple. Even this talk about perhaps a different quality. I wouldn't say inferior, but a different quality as compared to what was promised on the Facial ID. Considering that Facial ID was one of the key features, it's not just 3D sensors they've had an issue with. Well, that's one supply problem perhaps that's reported. But the second issue that they've also had is with, of course, their OLED screens. It was the first time that they were jumping from LCD displays to OLED displays. And there were issues with Samsung there as well, considering it was the only supplier of these screens.
Yeah, the OLED screen has been something that's been a long time coming, but Apple's embrace of this has really changed the demand curve, or the supply curve, I should say, for those devices. But certainly the reason they're switching to it is because the screen, by all accounts, is really a breathtaking display. And the question is how much are consumers really going to be willing to make that jump, or we can continue to see a migration from the Android system to the iPhone. We shall see when the device is out there in size.
Right, Corey. Tarun, also, another deterrent that I see really is, and we did a show here on Bloomberg Wind as well, where we actually went out to a lot of people here in Mumbai and asked them about the price tag, because the iPhone 10 out here, one being the wait for it, two being whether you actually get it after you've pre-ordered it today, because after 12:30 in the afternoon, it all seems sold out on Amazon and Flipkart. And the third thing being that it's 89,000 rupees. That's actually, 40% more than how much I'd spend in the US. Is that going to be a big deterrent for them?
I think it is.
It is. So if you look at the price of iPhone 10, it is
the size of the market.
Right, Corey. No, so that was a question I was posing to Tarun actually. Tarun, do you think that's going to be a big deterrent when it comes to selling the iPhone 10, and especially people who are, perhaps migrating from Android when Samsung has a formidable contender there, as does Google with the Pixel 2, which is launching actually just in a few minutes from now here at the launch party is in New Delhi.
Correct. So again, two parts to it. There are some hardcore Apple loyal users. So if you look at India market as a whole, the premium market. So if we dissect it, the number of phones which are sold above 50,000 in India, that's just 500,000 units per quarter, which is a very, very small quantity if you look at the size of the Indian market. So if we further dissect that 500,000 users, so with international warranty coming in with India, so a lot of people traveling across or other states might get in from other regions. What this will impact is the users who are looking for, like, for example, last year iPhone 7 users who are looking to buy iPhone 10, that can be a major deterrent because the price is definitely very high, and that doesn't hold true for iPhone 10 but also for the iPhone 8 and iPhone 8 Plus series. So now if you look at in the past couple of weeks, there are a lot of promotional offers which not only operators but other players are looking into bundling it with certain offers which have never been in India. So to make sure that the upfront cost of this particular device remains lesser by almost like $50 to $100. That remains to be seen how people react to the. There are a lot of sentiments floating around right now around iPhone 10, but the actual demand will be can be seen once this particular device is in the hands of the users and with the feedback floating in. Then it's going to be really critical to see how many people again jumps from Android to iOS ecosystem or upgrade from Android to Android.
You know, it's interesting, Corey, because while they have been pitching, Apple's been fantastic at marketing, while they've been pitching, well, facial ID as this breakthrough, revolutionary, standard-setting feature, well, we've seen some form of facial ID in a lot of other phones. In India as well, as there's no dearth of manufacturers who actually use facial ID, Samsung being one. It's a very popular device as well. But it seems to be that when Apple really sets the trend when it comes to these features, be it facial ID and getting rid of the fingerprint sensor, getting rid of the 3.5mm jack as well. It seems to be in setting up a new industry benchmark every time.
They used to refer to this as the Steve Jobs reality distortion field. That things that were completely untrue, if Steve were to say them, they became true because he said them. Well, the reality distortion field is alive and well at Cupertino, California, at Apple headquarters, because if they say it's brand new and revolutionary, then by gosh, it's brand new and revolutionary, whether it is or it isn't. And Apple's been at that for decades, and they continue to do so. But because of the size of this device in the market, because it's so singularly successful, the iPhones have been in the past, and this one may well be, and indeed this may be the best-selling phone ever. But it will certainly set a standard because it will be the phone in people's hands. It's also worth noting that in an industry with so many players, that while Apple may have only, say, 30% market share because of the high prices we've been talking about, because of all the features they cram into the phone and that are so expensive, they might only have 30% market share, but they have well over 80% of the profits in the industry. So they, unlike the Apple of many decades ago, they are very conscious about very high gross margins, high operating margins, and taking a lot of profit. They're very happy with 30% market share as long as they get most of the share of the industry's profits.
Right, Corey. Tarun, I also wanted to ask you, it's always interesting, especially on all these tech blogs all over the world, because as soon as, well, this pre-order news came out, there's also been news all over, all websites about the iPhone 9's design being leaked and stuff like that. Obviously, none of it is corroborated yet, but it's interesting because, well, effectively speaking, in a few months from now, 7-8 months from now, there might just be a new iPhone. That's not all, right? If you talk even about this immersive display, something that we were talking to Neil at Counterpoint earlier when the iPhone 10 was actually launched, was that this isn't really a bezel-less display. There is some sort of a bezel at the top. When it comes to other immersive displays, they're saying that OnePlus is now coming out with a new model as well with an immersive display, and you have it well on even cheaper budget phones here in India, on LG phones. You also have it, of course, on the Samsung phones, on the flagships. Do you think that these are features that will hold them in good stead in a market where they're actually trying to really get more market share in India?
Right. So basically, if we talk about the basic underlying fact why iPhone sells so well across the world is leaving apart from spec. It is the aspirational value of this particular brand, which helps it to record a large number of sales across all the different regions. So if you look at here in India, this holds true. The aspirational value attached to this particular brand is very, very high. So in fact, if you ask any particular college-going student here whether he or she would like to have an iPhone, the answer 9 out of 10, it will be yes. But the second question, if you ask them whether you can afford an iPhone, and that's the really interesting question, because here in India, they just want to buy an iPhone irrespective of whatever generation it is. So it might not be the latest, but it should be an iPhone. So that is something, because India is a very diverse and different market from the rest of the world. If you look at it, it's the fastest growing market. At the same time, it also has a lot of feature phone users. So yes, there are a lot of players who are offering different specs, but the real selling point for Apple in India and obviously across the world is the aspirational value which is attached to this particular brand, which is very, very high.
Right, Corey, as the last question, you were talking about the Apple ecosystem and how Apple really locks you into that ecosystem. But when it comes to tech giants all over Silicon Valley, be it, well, even Amazon or even what Google's really doing, they are trying to lock you into, even OnePlus really trying to lock you into that ecosystem. And there are a lot of fans here, especially back in India, of stock Android and that experience. And that's why Google's perhaps tied up with a lot of OEMs, a lot of manufacturers here, including Nokia at HMD Global and other companies, Motorola as well, to give that stock Android experience. Because sometimes people lack that freedom with those security patches and updates. But it's a different story altogether in the US, isn't it?
You know, the products can be a little bit somewhat similar, right? They do some of the same stuff. Some of the apps work on both phones, or there are versions for each kind of phone and each kind of device. But the business model behind it is diametrically different. And I think that because with the consumer-facing aspect is what it is, we tend to put them together and think of Google versus Amazon, or sorry, Google versus Apple, or Samsung versus Apple. But really, the Apple business model, which is use this device, pay us for the device, get some services on the side, is completely different from the Google business model, which is Google will spend fortunes, billions of dollars developing software and give it away to phone operators, so the phone operators will give them phones that gives information to Google and uses Google's apps to put eyeballs in front of ads that Google is selling. It's an advertising model where the consumer is the product and the consumer's eyeballs are the product, and the phones and the ecosystem is merely a methodology to get out to those consumers. Whereas the Apple system is very different from that, where it's give us your money, you can have the device and do what you will with it. We're going to keep all of your data and everything else secret and internal at Apple. It's a very different business model, and I think the result is the profits from the industry in the phone business go to Apple. The profits for the use of the phones goes to Google. It's a completely different model.
Absolutely, Corey. Thanks so much. I really appreciate you and Tarun joining us on Primetime on Bloomberg Quint. Well, it turns out the Apple iPhone 10, the flagship that you're waiting for, is already sold out at the pre-order stage for now.